Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in this series of SCI's SCItalk series of online events. I'm Steve Ranger. I'm the editor-in-chief of SCI, which means I oversee Chemistry and Industry magazine, as well as the news on the SCI website and social media. If you're not aware of what SCI does, it's a non-for-profit which brings together scientists, entrepreneurs, and industry to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing society, from climate change and sustainability to health and well-being. So if you are interested in becoming a member, if you're not already a member, then please do visit SCI.org to find out more details about how to become a member. Part of the mission of SCI is public outreach, which brings us to today's event on regenerative agriculture. Just to say for now, during the talk, all attendees will be on mute, but I'm sure you will have lots and lots of questions to ask. So the best way to do that is to type them into the questions box, and I will pick them up at the end of the talk, and hopefully we'll have time to answer a few of them. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, which is Louise Manning. Louise is an absolute expert on this sector, has been working in informing strategy, policy, and business efficiency in the agri-food sector for a long time, and has published over 140 papers on the topic, and is a great speaker, and I'm super excited to introduce her. As I say, if you've got questions, type them into the box and we'll keep them till the end. And I'm looking forward to a really great session. So Louise, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you. And thank you for the introduction and asking me to speak today. So I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Louise Manning. I was formerly Professor of Sustainable Agri-Food Systems at the University of Lincoln. And I've been involved in looking at agriculture, farming, food policy for around 40 years. And I'm going to focus in this talk on what regenerative agriculture means to a range of stakeholders in the supply chain. If we just step back a moment before we think of regenerative agriculture in particular, there are multiple challenges that face our current food system. Primary among those is food loss and food waste, but also increasingly focusing on soil health, plant health, animal health, and human health, and how we are going to maintain health and well-being in our climate-constrained future. We see in the UK and around the world low economic returns at farm gate, which is a real challenge for farming businesses in how they invest, transition, and drive innovation going forward when there is so little profitability for some farming sectors. And there is an increasing demand at global, national, and local scales for nature recovery and biodiversity recovery. And this sits again primarily with those who manage the land. And across the world, this is the farming community. We see issues around water quality, both in terms of the increasing urban population and the waste that leaves urban areas and how it is effectively managed, but also how we reduce point source and diffuse pollution from agricultural businesses. And across the world, and especially in the UK, we are required to meet legally binding targets for reducing greenhouse emissions and moving on the trajectory towards net zero. So there is a stark societal need to address these challenges in the food system. The real issue is that generally governments and markets do not want to pay either to solve these problems or to accelerate the innovations that drive change. It's important here to recognize that governments, if they are funding this change within the food system, are primarily using taxpayers' money, and markets where there is an uplift in price, for example, with some of the transitions. Again, it is the citizen that is paying for the change that is required. So we have a real issue that there are multiple challenges in how our food system is currently operating, but the solutions for how we address that, the finances that's behind it, is very slow to come to the market to meet those challenges. So my first question is in this webinar is business as usual a viable option? I want to start with a global perspective of business as usual, and then I'm going to come to a very specific UK perspective. So if we look at the share of land that is degraded in 2019, it's important to reflect that 77% of the global population are on the continents of Asia and Africa. And where we have data, we can see that there is significant land degradation and a reduction of the biological and economic profitability of that land. That is a significant issue, both in terms of economic growth across the world going forward and what underpins it in terms of the populations that would drive that growth, but also in terms of nature and biodiversity recovery. In fact, looking at this global map, there are many areas of the world where we don't have up-to-date and clear information on the global state of land. If we think about soil lifespans, and it's important when you look at this graph to recognize that the x-axis at the bottom is a logarithmic axis. So each space is not equal. It goes up in factors of 10. And if we look at some of the research that's being done in terms of how long do we have left, how many harvests do we have left, there is around 34% of our land where it is estimated that their lifespan is less than 100 years. And we've seen a lot of conversation, both at policy level and also for at national level, thinking about this particular issue. I've just picked the worst statistic, but we can see that we have an issue in terms of soil health and soil quality and how we improve our soils going forward. If we think of crop inputs and we look at our global population that currently is reliant on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and we also think about the drive to reduce greenhouse emissions and the volume of greenhouse emissions that are associated with nitrogen fertilizers, this has brought into sharp focus the farming methods that we use, especially our crop inputs. However, if we look at fertilizer use per head of the world population from 1961 to 2022, we will see that the original rise in synthetic inputs per capita has leveled off as many farming businesses have sought to look at their use of synthetic inputs over the last 20 years. And I'm going to talk about that a little more at a local level. But if we look at the challenges of excess use of nitrogen per hectare of cropland, we can see there are many regions of the world where there is an imbalance between the amount of nitrogen that is being applied per hectare and the amount that's being used. The challenge is if there is excess nitrogen being applied and the plant does not use that up, we have a much greater risk in storm events or rainfall for diffuse pollution, which can affect water quality. We also have other areas of the world where communities still do not have access to these inputs. And we see the challenge in terms of our soil quality where nitrogen is being depleted from soils. We can see similar data associated with phosphorus, for example. So what does this global picture tell us? This global picture tells us that business as usual is not viable, that we have to move forward and think about other ways in which we can still feed a large global population, especially as I stated earlier, in continents such as Asia and Africa. And we can feed that population in a way that is sustainable. What do I mean by sustainability in this context? Well, sustainable means that, using the Brundtland definition, that the activities that we undertake today, how we manage our soils, how we manage the land more widely, the level of pollinators that we have, the amount of wider nature that we have in place, that we are in, we have a situation right now that does not affect the future ability to produce food on this planet. We can then come and think about the UK in particular, and whether business as usual in the UK is a viable option. One of the greatest challenges in UK agriculture, probably over the last 20 years, is that there has been a managed retreat in terms of economic performance at farm level. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that as land prices have continued to rise over the last 20 years, we have seen a much lower return in terms of the value of that land. And we have seen a much lower return in terms of profitability. In 2023, agriculture, and in agriculture, I'm talking about pre-farm gate activity, contributed only 0.5% of UK gross value addition. And 29% of farms delivered 89% of the output on 73% of the land. This suggests that we have a huge divergence in terms of the types of farms that we have in the UK and also their productive output. But over the last 10 years, as I said, we have seen land prices rise significantly. We have seen the return on capital employed in England, where I have this data. Over the last 10 years, it's fluctuated by 0.5% to minus 0.8%, which was the figure last year. And I don't think the appropriate word is interesting, but I await the data for this year, given the real challenges that agricultural businesses have had across the UK in terms of the drought. What does this mean? This means that businesses may be able to keep going, but they're going to be focusing on a number of issues within those farming businesses so that they can remain in business. They may not have the mindset or the ability to invest in new technologies or change. And if we are to have the change that we need to improve soil health, human health, and drive better crop health and animal health to drive yields and productivity, we need to think about how we can effectively change the systems that we have now. So business today in the UK, for any organisation, not just agricultural businesses or the agricultural supply chain, is not usual. And you can see that in any of the statistics that, any of the economic statistics that are released on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And one of the major challenges in England is that direct government support of agriculture is ceasing in 2026. for businesses that have fluctuated between a 0.5% and a minus 0.8% return on capital invested, to then lose one of their main income streams from direct government support is causing many businesses to reflect on their business model. When we start to look at the financial analysis of UK agriculture, and we start to look at the financial analysis of regenerative farming systems too, one of the challenges we have is that, and when we're comparing conventional versus regenerative, is that there was always the assumption, as payments were delinked from farmers, as the thoughts of farmers being paid for supplying natural capital, for supplying natural benefits to society. There was always the assumption that either the government would be prepared to pay for it through public payments, or that there would be green or carbon payments from private funding for such regenerative systems. As I said right at the beginning, we have a challenge where, if we are to move to more regenerative farming systems, if the market isn't prepared to pay for that change in farm standards, if the efficiencies are not derived from, if the efficiencies and yields are not derived from the actual practices that are employed, at the moment we have a very fledgling green and carbon payments to support businesses in transition. This is at stark contrast to the organic movement, for example, and the transition payments that were paid over many decades for businesses that were transforming from one system to another, or indeed the higher level scheme payments. We await the current government's decisions on how public payments for public goods will go forward in terms of the environmental land management scheme, and in terms of the higher level schemes that sit within it, or the sustainable farming initiative. But for many businesses right now, they are in uncertain times as they look to change their farming practices. Many of the systems that have been looked at, and much of the financial case studies, have been based on arable enterprises and not mixed farming enterprises, nor grass-based livestock systems. So we need to have a lot more insight into how the finances of those particular systems. And one of the big challenges when we look at family farms in particular is that in many of these calculations, labour costs that are included do not include the non-paid family labour that is often utilised within farms, given the return on capital that I identified earlier. So, is business as usual a viable option? I would answer no, it isn't. So we need to think about how we make pre-farm gate businesses more financially resilient, more environmentally resilient, and more socially resilient for the people that operate them. And regenerative agriculture, with its focus on better resource efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency, phosphorus use efficiency, and more generally good agricultural practices approaches around soil health, in adopting many of these strategies, this can support reducing the cost of inputs to deliver a financial output that is better for those farming businesses. And this is one challenge that I have when we think about the context of regenerative agriculture. Because at the one level, we have a view on food self-sufficiency, food production. On the other, we have the requirement that farming businesses are financially stable, are deriving more profitability pre-farm gate. And much of the discussion that is taking place around regenerative agriculture is focusing on those two major challenges. So for many people that are familiar with regenerative agriculture, they'll be familiar with the 5 principles that you can see before you that lie at the heart of discussions around regenerative agriculture and the kinds of practices that can be adopted on farm. We also see around the world certification schemes that are developing around regenerative agriculture as part of a farm assurance, potentially long-term market access focus on becoming more regenerative in your practices of food production. One of the real challenges we have is that whilst organic practices, there are very clear principles and practices. You see the principles for regenerative here as a comparison. Many of those requirements are laid down in law. So for a product to be labeled as organic, it has to meet certain legal criteria. We're still at the beginning with regenerative agriculture in terms of how we balance the transparency and the transparency of standards, and also the confidence that consumers can have when they are buying products that potentially are labeled as regenerative. Now, it may be for many supply chains, the principles of regenerative agriculture may be promoted within those supply chains, but currently there is no intention to label products with statements or even certification to regenerative standards. However, that means that there can be a wide range of actions that comply with these principles that could be described as regenerative. One of the challenges we have when we think about regenerative agriculture is that for many farming businesses, they have specialized in order to drive economies of scale or to take cost out of their supply chains and their businesses, as we've seen margins being squeezed. So there are many farms across the UK that will only undertake one particular type of enterprise. What lies at the heart of regenerative agriculture and a reduction in the use of artificial fertilizers is that livestock are integrated into the system for a number of reasons, but the use of farmyard manures and livestock manures lies within a drive to, in part, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from artificial fertilizer. However, for many farms, that creates a real challenge. And I'm going to come back to talk about some practical ways in which that is currently being addressed. So the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture: minimizing soil disturbance, so moving to no-till or min-till rather than ploughing, protecting the soil surface and keeping it covered for as much of the year as you can, having a diversity within your crop rotation, but also a diversity within the farm landscape, and, as I also identified, integrating livestock. So I am a farmer. I have a 350-acre family farm with my family in Herefordshire, And these photos were all taken from my farm. Because the challenge about being regenerative and moving from an extractive business plan, where you are extracting from your land, to a more regenerative, nurturing type of farming, is that it will be different on every single farm. So the farmers that have been on this journey for 20, 25 years in the UK specifically, especially as a consequence of the Countryside Stewardship and Higher Level Scheme funding, which our own farm has been involved in, they have been on this journey for some time. So on our own farm, there are instances where we might have to plough because there is a distinct agricultural reason for why we need to plough, but largely we have moved to min-till systems across our own farm. We put much of our arable land 20 years ago into arable reversion. We produce our own energy on our farm, and we have integrated many of the principles of regenerative agriculture. But would my husband call himself a regenerative farmer? Probably not. And the real challenge that we face is that many of these practices are being adopted and have been adopted for a long period of time, but we haven't recognized those practices over time. And there has been no market uplift for many of these practices. There has been a huge benefit to those particular farms in terms of the biodiversity on the farm and the resilience on the farm, but it's context specific. How do you develop schemes? How do you create transparency with consumers when you say, but if, in this particular instance, this might be described as regenerative, in another instance, it looks very different. So ultimately, who gets to decide what good looks like? And how do we bring together a whole group of stakeholders who are looking at the concept of regenerative agriculture to deliver a whole set of different outcomes? And one of the challenges we face is that whilst the principles of good business management, the principles of better resource efficiency, of improving livability and productivity and well-being of your livestock, or improving crop health, being able to precision spray so that you aren't blanket spraying your crops. While all of these are important practices that all farmers would recognize they need to adopt, and indeed in supply chains, they would recognize that they need to promote these practices on farm, this is being done at an individual and a business scale. So one of the challenges around that is, where is the scalability? So if you were to take on my own farm with our sheep, we are working with neighboring farmers, going back to those 5 principles of regenerative. So our sheep will go on to their cover crops. Our sheep will move on to their farm for certain types of times of the year. So we're seeing collaboration at local level. We are seeing a greater insight into being able to manage your inputs more effectively. But where do we get the step change we need faced with some of the big pledges that have been set by government? For example, the methane pledge, the biodiversity recovery, delivery of net zero. And there is a mismatch between the efforts that are being undertaken at farm level, the supply chain initiatives, and the very significant goals that governments and policymakers have set, either at national or local scale. So starting to bring those thoughts together, the regenerative agriculture, we need to be in a situation where we can improve soil health, where we can make sure that our soils have the lifespan that we require. We can implement measures at field and farm level to improve nutrient efficiency and to improve productivity, either through the application of technology, the application of new thinking, or working more collaboratively with others, as I've just described, so that we can maximize the benefits over a number of farms in an area. But when we start to think of this regenerative thinking, at what scale are we talking about? We've talked about field, we've talked about farm, we've talked about landscapes, but the conversation about regenerative is actually getting much wider. And what lies at the heart of delivering these objectives is we require science. And I would say that because I am a scientist, but I'm also involved with the farming business, and our business cries out for the evidence to help us to transition to less extractive and more resilient and regenerative and climate smart farming systems. And one particular aspect of science that sits at the heart of this is chemistry, and in particular biochemistry. So if you were to look at this photo, you may wonder why I've put this photo in the presentation. If I had photographed this grass in my field at the end of August, it would have been yellow because of lack of rainfall. We are working, as are many other farmers that are seeking to be more resilient and in their farming, to have grassland that can recover and quickly. And this photo was taken 3 weeks later. But what lies at the heart of this photo? What lies at the heart of this photo is not only the rainfall that we needed, but the photosynthesis that these plants have undertaken. And sometimes we forget the chemistry that sits at the heart of regenerative agriculture. How do we support the livestock and the plants to optimize their performance, but from not only a productivity and farm financial resilience viewpoint, but from an environmental and viewpoint too. So as we go forward and think about regenerative agriculture, and I hope some of this will come out in the questions, we can think about the scale at which we're thinking about regenerative agriculture. Are we thinking about it at that field scale? Are we thinking about it at a farm scale? And it's really important when we think of farms and farmers to think that farm can change from year to year. Farmers may rent ground in one area one year, and they may rent different ground at another time. So what it is, if we're thinking about farms being regenerative, we already have a number of complexities. Can we think around collaboration between farmers so that we move to a more resilient and regenerative system in terms of businesses and activities? Do we have to think of it on a landscape scale? And in the UK, for example, there have been a number, 2 rounds of landscape recovery projects where embedding nature recovery and food production lies at the heart. Or are we going to be looking at regenerative agriculture and regenerative food and start to think about the communication direct to consumers? And we will be labeling ingredients regenerative, products regenerative, or even starting to talk about making your diet more more regenerative and less extractive. So we come back to the challenges that I put at the beginning. There is a real drive and there is a real focus on changing the way we produce food in the UK. And across the world, to move towards less extractive, more resilient and sustainable processes and practices. There is also the drive to look at how we can accelerate the innovations in terms of utilizing data, utilizing technologies to drive that change that is required. The real challenge for me is at the moment that is a whole set of disparate activity, very well-meaning, but very often disparate. We're seeing individual farmers who are changing their farming practices, while the farmers next to them may be undertaking a totally different set of practices. We see policymakers that are developing policy, but those policies once generated are not driving outcomes or impact in terms of the way that farming is changing. And we can also think of citizens across the UK. If we look at regenerative agriculture, at that headline level, we need to reflect on food security, that all people in all places and at all times have access to safe, affordable, nutritious food. And for me, making our food more nutritious, making our businesses more financially, environmentally, and socially resilient lies at the heart of how we drive regenerative agriculture forward. So I'm got some final details about myself, but I really wanted to spend as much time as possible in discussion and sharing questions. So I'm going to stop my sharing my slides there and look forward to engaging with the questions you may have.
Brilliant. Louise, that's been fantastic. Really, really deeply insightful. It's a fascinating subject. So thank you for taking the time to talk about that. Just to sort of start the questions, give you a chance to have a quick breather. One of the things I'm really interested in is this seems to be such an important kind of movement, and you know, as you say, in terms of a lot of the other goals that governments are setting in terms of net zero or sustainability, and yet there seem to be an enormous number of hurdles in the way of it. Is there one particular hurdle that you could remove that would really create a kind of a significant difference that would improve things, or is it just there are just so many different smaller problems that need to be resolved?
I think the one big hurdle that needs to be removed is better communication. One of the challenges we have at the moment is confidence or trust in moving to a more regenerative farming system, trust in believing that there is a market for those products and that the price that farmers will be paid, especially at the beginning, if there is a drop in yield as you change practices, having trust and confidence that the market or indeed other financial institutions, the government will step in and support that transition is one of the key barriers that are holding people back.
Is there something of a kind of like a branding problem almost? I think a couple of times you've mentioned, how organic farming, has created, created a premium for itself, created an identity. Is there a sense that regenerative needs to do the same thing?
I would hate to see the gentrification of regenerative agriculture, that the benefits of eating food that has been produced in healthier soils, that is being produced in certain ways, is only for a certain type of people who could afford it. if I come back to that definition of food security, affordability is really important. And if we are to make the changes in terms of bird recovery in the UK, butterflies, bees, if we are to make space for nature, if we are to embed some of our climate smart agriculture, it can't just be a niche product, because the volume of food that is being produced has to be eaten by a much wider group of consumers.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've got one of the questions is that we've just got in the chat is I'll kind of edit down, but basically saying that regenerative agriculture is a kind of a set of different practices across systems and geography. It could be something like minimum tillage, or using less herbicides. Is it possible to reward farmers for those particular bits of context rather than just across? I think this is what the question is saying, rather than just the broadest sense of it is regenerative. If you can kind of narrow it down to different contexts and saying that this product has been created in this way, is that a way forward, rather than looking at the whole, look at the sort of detail?
I think there are certain practices that you would want all farmers to adopt, because they're the right thing to do, such as analysing your soils, for example. If the profitability of the farming business does not allow you to financially afford to sample your soils, if there is a policy initiative to keep food prices lower they're not low, but lower at the point of purchase, then we have to look for other mechanisms to support soil health. I would rather see that we have business models and we have levels of viable and resilient business where you can afford soil sampling and you can embed all of this into your farming practice. And in fairness, in many farming businesses, that is the case with the model that they have. To answer the question, so there may be certain practices we want every farmer to do. The government, in the 2.5 billion that they have promised that will come to farming businesses, could incentivise those particular actions, because actually they want all farmers to do them. There may be other specific practices where and we've seen Wild Farmed, for example, as a brand, and that's embedding a set of practices and that product going into M&S, or other practices that are advocated by businesses where they will pay individually for that. What we're also seeing is that banks want to make sure, if a bank was going to lend me money for investment on my farm for 30 years, they probably want to make sure that my farm is going to be there in 30 years when I'm still, I might not be, but the farm and the business is still there to make the repayments. So already seeing banks moving in this direction, where they're looking at what will be the potential risk and climate impact, and how sustainable are these businesses faced with the future. And it may be, and we're seeing banks already offering certain finance products, even looking at interest rates on loans. So I think there's lots of different, to answer Helen's question, I think there's lots of different ways in which this transition could be supported. And it's not just the market, but we need to be very clear which things we would require all farmers to do, because it's the right thing to do. And reward in that way, and which are specific to individual farms.
Great. Another question that's come in is looking at kind of like the international perspective. So if there are countries like the US or Brazil that don't go down the same path of regenerative agriculture, what does that mean around international competition? Can the UK compete, or can it protect its own markets? What does that kind of like international perspective on this look like?
Well, the challenge for me in saying yes, being regenerative is context specific, and it depends on the individual farms. But if we then if we make it too loose, we then have the challenge that we may have what it is to be regenerative defined in policy in many countries in different ways. So it's important that, and we have, so for example, if I give you another example, if we look at red tractor assurance, there are many food retailers, food businesses that put the red tractor on the finished product. So they're promoting its red tractor. Many others will say this is a condition of supply to the market access. If you're not red tractor assured, you as a farmer can't supply. I think it will be, whilst there will be policy initiatives, and you may well find elements of that in trade deals, the market will be the key area where they decide how these products are differentiated or not. And it may be business to business driving of regenerative rather than business to consumer.
Okay. One of the questions, I guess, sticking a little bit with that international context, was around, I think you mentioned that direct support for farms is kind of dropping away in 2026. Why is that happening? And does that have is there an international dimension to that? How does that compare to, say, what is being done in Europe?
So around the world, and especially in Europe, we have huge economic challenges. Post-COVID, and the money that was borrowed post-COVID during COVID by governments and others. And governments are making very stark decisions on what they will financially support and what they will not. And they are also recognizing, if you look in the UK, for example, between 2020 and 2025, the food basket has gone up by 30%. That doesn't mean that some people haven't changed the food they've got in their basket to try and reduce that price increase, but the typical food basket's gone up by 30%. That will always drive governments in terms of how they support or do not support agriculture. One of the biggest challenges we face is that governments look at the 0.56 return GVA and go, well, farming doesn't really underpin growth. If we look at the finance sector, that has a much larger proportion of the country's GDP. So when we have a trade deal, let's worry about that. But one of the reasons that agriculture has such a low percentage is that many agricultural businesses have chosen over the last 20 years to invest as farming businesses outside of agriculture. It's really difficult to get the data that demonstrates what proportion of tourism, what proportion of hospitality is linked to farming businesses. So to answer your question, I think that governments have a really tough choice, probably at least for the next 10, 15 years on where they spend their money. And we can see that in the UK. They have made a decision to no longer in England pay a direct payment to farmers. So if you were to go to Hereford Market when the lambs are being sold, you will see some lambs from Wales, where the farmers have had one particular support mechanism, and the farmers in England that are taking their lambs to the same market will have had a different support mechanism. So even within our own country, we're seeing these differences. And then you scale that up across Europe. The farming groups in Europe are very concerned at the moment when they look at the next set of proposals for CAP reform, and when they see the Mercosur deals and the American trade deal.
Okay, excellent. Slightly different question coming in now, which is, if there is lots of innovation going on, which I think there is kind of like, in terms of dealing with regenerative challenges, especially if these don't require huge funding. How do you share the results of innovations between farmers, or collaborations? How do we share that more effectively and cheaply, and kind of get that knowledge out there? Is there a mechanism for that yet?
So we've had multiple mechanisms for a long period of time for how you share information with farmers. I think it's important to recognize that many of these mechanisms are analog. They are, and we live in a digital world. The next generation of farmers are very much in a digital world, and we need to change the mechanisms for how we share information. The real challenge for academics and researchers is, in order to publish information, they need a very high level of certainty to be able to get a paper published, or to defend the research funding. Farmers would move on a much lower level of certainty than is needed for those academic papers. So I think the real challenge is between the research and the farm. How do we get that information out and scalable, and at scale? And we're going to have to do that through social media and other platforms.
Okay, great. A related question is, what do you think, talking about that research, what are some of the biggest research questions that, if addressed, could support this transition, whether that's at the soil, the plant level, or behavioural, economic questions higher up in the supply chain? Are there particular research questions that aren't answered yet, or haven't been answered properly, that would really help push things forward?
I think one of the big research questions is, how do we get actionable insights to farmers about their soil health? So how can we get better information in real time to farmers so that they can change their practices within the cycle? So it's and one of the projects I've recently been involved in has been looking at nitrogen use efficiency. How can you better guide the farmers during the growing season as to the nitrogen demands of the plant, rather than using the same processes you might have used every year? So there's a whole question about how we get more information around soil health. There is the whole question of, currently there are certain chemical processes that are used to mean that we can use min-till in terms of chemicals that are used on ground, so that you don't need to plough. In the event that we couldn't use those, where's the new next generation of crop protection products or soil improvers? Where are they coming from? How do we better understand the role of fungi in the soil? How do we better understand nitrogen fixation in the soil? I think these are all key questions that we need to answer. And we also need to be able to do the research, but also provide that to farmers in a way that they can take action from it. It's not just a report or a set of maps, or so what does this mean? We need to be clear on that with farmers. One of the things that we've done on our own farm, as an example, is we've put sound recorders on our farm to monitor birds. We can now see where the actions that we are taking and how that has impacted over the last 20 years on the birds that we have. Once we have a baseline, we can then start to think, well, then what practices do we need to employ in how we manage our sheep, how we manage our woodland to improve birds that are on the farm. So I have great hope that we'll be able to use a whole range of technology to support farmers.
Great. Talking about supporting the farmers, another of the questions we have is, how can we further encourage farmers effectively to accept a potential reduction in their yield, and therefore a reduction in their revenues, if they are to adopt regenerative? One obvious answer is some sort of government incentive, but as you say, that's sort of like lacking at the moment. Is there another way around that?
Historically, we have used schemes like the higher level scheme, and we have used what would be ELMS to support that loss in yield or that transition. We have £2.5 billion, which has been promised. We'll wait to see in the budget whether that is still ring fence for farmers. But that is a start to which could be match funded by a whole range of organisations towards supporting that loss in yield. There is quite a range in discussion in terms of how long that yield loss is for. In terms of our own farm, we moved completely away from arable and did full arable reversion of our farm. We then had that period of time before we've moved into the next enterprise, and individual farming businesses may undertake a whole range of activities and alternative income streams to cover that change.
Okay. Again, looking slightly broader again, I think there is perhaps understanding on the part of the farmers and the researchers and the scientists that this is a change that needs to come. But the question we've got here is how do we measure this and prove this and communicate the benefits of regenerative agriculture to the rest of the world, so to consumers, to investors, to banks and supermarkets. How do we get that message out that this is important and has to be done? Because that seems to be understood at the level of the individual farms and the scientists and researchers, but actually getting that out to the rest of the world seems quite difficult.
So as I was saying, we've got lots of activity at farm level. We've got lots of policy initiatives, but we're not drawing them all together. The real challenge is we need to be able to baseline where our farms are right now. And we need to be able to do that. Now we may have natural capital accounting, and the government is looking at mechanisms for natural capital accounting. One of the real challenges, if we look at national scale data sets, is they provide a set of information to policymakers and for driving strategic change, but the metrics that you might use at farm level are very different, that will give the actionable insight to the farmer to go, this is what I need to do. And we need to run them side by side. One of the key focuses, however, is on communicating this at the product level. And that is a totally different set of metrics again. And so farmers, if they are providing data, we need to just ask them once for that data. We need to have a mechanism for how we use that data afterwards. The real challenge for me is that there are a number of consumers that are increasingly being turned off by virtue signaling. This product is regenerative, this product's natural, this product is low carbon, when they have no means of being able to verify that themselves. We've also got to think about how we can enable consumers to better verify the information that they're being given. If we're asking people to spend more money on a given food, if we're asking them to actually buy into regenerative agriculture, we need to be able to engage with them and the impact of their decisions. So when I had my first computer, it was probably about 1/10 of the capacity of my phone. We have the most wonderful tool to be able to communicate to multiple consumers about the real impact of their purchasing decisions. And that moves it from virtue signaling that we're a good business because we care about regenerative, to them really seeing the concrete benefits of what they're doing.
Fantastic. Now, we're pretty much out of time, but I just want to ask one last question, or just maybe give you a chance to maybe end with a little bit of positivity. If this goes well, what does the sort of the future of agriculture look like if regenerative comes in properly and kind of like, you know, in terms of delivering the promise it has? What does the world look like?
And I've also seen James's question about, isn't it about profitability? Yes. A good future is where farmers have a good return on capital invested, and they have profitable farming businesses. And that may mean that we have to move away from yield. So to give you an example, if you were to look at some sheep farmers, they are not producing the largest number of lambs per ewe. So in terms of yield, people go, well, they're not particularly good farmers, but they are driving better profitability. They've got a much more low-cost system. So we need to move beyond. We need to move beyond those metrics of yield and quite superficial metrics to really start to drill down into farming businesses and look at their profitability. But we also need to ensure that we have the right tools to support farmers to be able to make those financial decisions.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much. This has been an absolutely fascinating session. I'd say if you are also interested in this, we do have another session coming up. This is the first in the series. Next up is the one on the 29th of October, which is looking at sustainable innovations for regenerative agriculture. And I hope to see it that one as well, because it's a really great series. So just remains for me to say thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your excellent questions, and above all, thank you, Louise, for an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you and goodbye.